At a little after 9 in the morning, on a clear day in the late spring of 1951, at 40,000 feet above the Yalu River, a Soviet fighter pilot in the cockpit of a swept-wing jet looked down through air so cold that his own breath had frozen on the inside of the canopy, and saw a flight of American fighters that could not climb to where he was. He was a veteran, and so were many of the men in his regiment. They had flown against the Luftwaffe in the last years of the war in the East, in a school harder than any the Americans had attended. The flight suit he wore carried no Soviet markings. He had been ordered, before he ever crossed into Korean airspace, never to speak Russian over the radio, never to fly out over the open sea, and under no circumstances to let himself be taken alive. Officially, he was not there. Officially, the jet beneath him belonged to China. The jet was a MiG-15, and in that year at that altitude, it was the master of the sky. It climbed faster than anything the Americans had brought to the war. It flew higher. The cannon in its nose could take the wing off a bomber. For the men who flew it in those first months, there was every reason to believe they held the better machine, and that the enemy struggling in the thin air below had come to a fight he could not win. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. They were not wrong about the machine. They were wrong about nearly everything else. Within a little more than 2 years, the MiGs would all but disappear from that corner of the sky. And the part of the story worth explaining is that they were not driven out by a faster jet. To understand how the men who owned the high air over the Yalu came to lose it, you have to go back to the autumn of 1950, to the morning the West first learned that the MiG existed. For the opening months of the Korean War, the air had not been contested. After the North Korean invasion in June of 1950, the United States and its allies swept the small North Korean Air Force out of the sky in a matter of weeks. The straight-winged American jets, the F-80 Shooting Star and the F-84 Thunderjet, and the old P-51 Mustangs called back into service, flew where they wanted. They knocked down bridges. They burned supply columns. They escorted the heavy B-29 super fortresses against targets in the north, and they did it with the ease of men who believed the air war had already been won. On the 1st of November, 1950, that belief ended in the span of a few minutes over the Yalu. New aircraft came down out of the north, across the river that marked the border with Manchuria. They had swept wings, a shape almost no one in the theater had seen on a fighter in service, and they came through the American formations at a speed and a rate of climb that nothing in the area could match. They fired, and they were gone, back across the river, before the slower jets could turn to meet them. The aircraft was the McCoy-Gravich MiG-15, and it was a genuine surprise because nothing the Americans were flying could live with it in a climb. It had a wing swept back at 35 degrees. It was small, light, and brutally powerful for its size, and the source of that power carried an irony that few of the men firing at it that winter could have guessed. The engine in the MiG-15 was a descendant of the Rolls-Royce Nene, a British design, examples of which the British government had sold to the Soviet Union in the late 1940s in a decision it would spend years regretting. Soviet engineers had taken the Nene apart, improved it, and put it into mass production. The heart of the fighter, now tearing into American bombers over Korea, had been born in an English factory. The MiG had a service ceiling above 50,000 feet, higher than any American fighter in Korea could reach and still fight in. Its armament was built for one purpose: the destruction of heavy bombers. A single 37mm cannon and two 23mm cannon, weapons that fired a heavy, slow stream of explosive shells. 3 or 4 hits were enough to bring down a B-29. The same armament, as the Soviets would learn, was a harder thing to use against a small, fast, jinking fighter because the big cannon fired slowly and their shells dropped quickly, and a pilot had to be close and steady to land them. But against the bombers, in the late autumn of 1950, the MiG was murderous. The United States had exactly one aircraft that could meet a swept-wing jet on something close to even terms, and it was not yet in Korea. It was the North American F-86 Sabre, and within weeks of the MiG's appearance, the decision was made to send it. The 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing packed its Sabres and its pilots and shipped them across the Pacific. The first of them reached Korea in the middle of December 1950. On the 17th of December, Lieutenant Colonel Brewsington, leading a flight of the winged Sabres over the northwest, caught a MiG-15 and shot it down. It was the first time the two fighters had met in combat, and it was the beginning of a duel that would run in the same narrow stretch of sky for the next 2.5 years. That stretch of sky had a name. The American pilots called it MiG Alley, the northwest corner of Korea where the Yalu emptied toward the sea and the MiG bases lay just across the water. And here was the first hard fact the Sabre pilots had to swallow. The MiGs flew from airfields at Antung on the Manchurian side of the river, and the Americans were forbidden to cross it. The border was politics, not geography, and the politics held. A MiG in trouble could dive across the Yalu and be safe. A Sabre could not legally follow. The men who flew the MiGs fought with a sanctuary at their backs, a place they could always run to, and the men in the Sabres fought with the knowledge that the river was a wall only one side had to respect. The second hard fact took longer to surface because it was a secret, and it was kept so well that the American public would not learn the truth of it for many years. The question was simple. Who was flying the MiGs? The official answer was Chinese and North Korean pilots, and many of the MiGs were indeed flown by them. But in the crucial sector along the Yalu, in the units that did the most damage, the men in the cockpits were Soviet. They belonged to the 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, a Soviet formation deployed in secret to hold the airspace over the border and to blood a new generation of fighter pilots against the Americans. They were, many of them, very good. The Corps included pilots who had finished the war against Germany with long lists of victories. For a time, the 324th Fighter Aviation Division in Korea was commanded by Ivan Kozadub, the highest-scoring fighter pilot the Allies produced in the Second World War, a man credited with 62 victories against the Luftwaffe. Kozadub ran his division, trained it, and ascended into battle, but he was forbidden to fly combat himself. He was too valuable, and the political cost of a man like that being shot down and captured over Korea was more than Moscow would risk. So the most successful Allied ace of the last war sat on the ground and watched his pilots fly, and some of those pilots were nearly as dangerous as he had been. This is the picture worth holding before the duel itself begins. A Soviet fighter regiment, flying a jet that could climb and shoot above anything the Americans had, from a base they could not be followed to, crewed in large part by combat veterans, fighting under a deception so complete that the enemy did not officially know who they were. On paper, in the autumn and winter of 1950 and in 1951, the men who flew the MiG held every advantage that mattered. The aircraft sent to take those advantages away was, in several respects, the inferior machine. The early F-86 Sabre, the A model, was powered by a General Electric J-47 engine, and it could not match the MiG in a climb or follow it to its ceiling. Where the MiG was built light and lethal at altitude, the Sabre was built heavier, with systems the MiG did not have, and the cost was performance in the thin air at the top of the fight. The Sabre carried 6 50-caliber machine guns, a battery that threw out a fast, flat stream of bullets, and the men who designed it had chosen volume and rate of fire over the heavier punch of cannon. It was a choice that would be argued about for the rest of the war because the MiG was a tough aircraft, and Sabre pilots would put long bursts of 50-caliber fire into MiGs and watch them fly home trailing smoke when a cannon shell or two would have finished them. But the Sabre had things the MiG did not, and the most important of them could not be measured on a climb chart. It was a superb gun platform, steady and predictable at high speed, where the MiG grew nervous and began to snake. It could be dived harder and held more precisely as it approached the speed of sound. And it was flown, in those first months, by a high proportion of men who had done this before, American pilots who had fought in the Second World War, and who came to Korea already knowing what air combat asked of them. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. Behind those men stood something the Soviet pilots over the Yalu did not have. It would matter more than the wing sweep or the engine or the guns. It was the way the two air forces handled the one resource that wins air wars over time, which is not aircraft but experience. The Americans rotated their pilots through the war as individuals. A man flew a set number of missions, often around 100, and then he went home, and a new pilot took his place beside men who had already been in the fight. The squadron never emptied of veterans all at once. Knowledge accumulated and was handed down. Every combat was filmed by gun cameras, studied on the ground, argued over, turned into doctrine, and taught to the next man. A Sabre pilot arriving in Korea in 1952 stepped into a unit that had been refining how to fight the MiG for over a year, and that hard-won knowledge was handed to him almost as soon as he arrived. The Soviet system worked the other way. The 64th Corps rotated its units whole. A division came to Korea, fought its tour, grew sharp and dangerous in combat, and was then withdrawn in its entirety and replaced by a fresh division that had never seen a Sabre. When the experienced regiments left, their experience left with them. The new arrivals had to learn the same lessons over again, in combat, against an enemy who never forgot anything. And the Chinese and North Korean pilots, who flew an increasing share of the MiGs as the war went on, were greener still, rushed through shortened training and thrown against American units that were at the peak of their craft. The MiG had the altitude. The Soviets had the veterans, at least at first. For most of 1951, that was enough, and there were days that year when it was more than enough, when the men in the MiGs proved exactly how dangerous they could be. What changed over the next 18 months was not the sky, and it was not the river. It was almost everything underneath them. The first thing that changed was the Sabre itself. Through 1951, the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing and the smaller 51st Wing, which converted to Sabres in December of that year, were flying a machine that could not match the MiG at altitude and knew it. The solution was not to build a better aircraft from the ground up. There was no time for that. The solution was to improve what existed and to give the pilots who flew it a tool that would make the most of every second they spent within range of a MiG. The gun sight was where the improvement mattered most. The early Sabre carried an optical sight, a fixed reticle that showed a pilot where his guns were aimed but told him nothing about where the bullets would be by the time they traveled the distance to the target. The calculation of deflection, of how far ahead to shoot a crossing or turning enemy, was done inside the pilot's head, in fractions of a second, under the pressure of combat, with another man's gun searching for him while he worked. Most pilots, even experienced ones, got it wrong more often than they got it right. The gun camera footage from the first year of the war was full of long bursts fired at correct angles into empty air, the bullets arriving where the MiG had been rather than where it was. The A for lead computing gun sight changed that calculation. It used a ranging radar to measure the exact distance to a target and fed that information into a mechanical computer that moved the gun sight reticle automatically, placing it where the bullets needed to go rather than where the guns were pointing. A Sabre pilot using the A4 still had to track his target smoothly and hold the sight on it long enough for the computer to work, but the deflection problem was solved for him. Men who had been fighters for years suddenly found that they were killing at ranges and angles they had never attempted before. The math that had always cost them kills was being done by a machine faster than any man could do it, and it was being done correctly every time. The F-86E model, arriving in Korea through 1951, brought with it a fully powered flying tail, a horizontal stabilizer that moved as a single unit rather than relying on elevators alone, which gave the pilot far more precise pitch control at high speed, where the earlier Sabre had grown sluggish. The F-86F, reaching the wings in 1952, carried a more powerful version of the J-47 engine and a modified wing that improved high-altitude performance. None of these changes closed the gap between the Sabre's ceiling and the MiGs entirely. The MiG still had the high ground, but the gap narrowed, and in a fight that often lasted seconds, a narrower gap was a different fight. While the Sabre improved in increments, the force on the other side of the Yalu was discovering something it had not expected. The MiG-15 was a better aircraft in several of the ways that mattered most at altitude, and the men who flew it best knew how to use those advantages. The tactic was simple and difficult to counter. Come down from altitude in a fast diving pass, fire, and climb back up before the Sabre could bring its guns to bear. A MiG that stayed in that pattern was almost impossible to catch and almost impossible to kill. The problem was that it was also nearly impossible to be decisive in that pattern against a well-flown Sabre, because the American pilots had learned to brake hard into any attack and deny the MiG the steady tracking time it needed. The fight that demonstrated the cost of abandoning that discipline, on morning that the American bomber crews would carry for the rest of their lives, came in the last week of October 1951. The target was Namsi Airfield in northwest Korea, and the weapon was the B-29, which had been hitting targets across the north throughout the war, but had never faced what it met over Namsi on the 23rd of October. A large formation of super fortresses, with an escort of F-84 Thunderjets and a covering screen of Sabres positioned to intercept, flew into the northwest corridor and was hit by a coordinated attack from several MiG regiments. The Sabres were positioned too far from the bombers and were occupied with their own fights by the time the MiGs reached the formation. 3 B-29s were shot down during the bomb run. 5 more were damaged so severely that they barely reached friendly territory. The super fortresses that made it back to their bases at Okinawa came home with dead and wounded aboard in airframes that would never fly again. It was the worst single day the B-29 force suffered in the Korean War, and the lesson written in those losses was unambiguous. Daylight bombing of northwest Korea, within range of the MiG bases across the river, without close Sabre escort at the same altitude as the bombers, was no longer survivable. The 8th Air Force drew that conclusion and acted on it. The B-29s went to night bombing in the northwest, which reduced their accuracy and reduced their losses in roughly equal measure. The MiGs, which were day fighters without the instrument and radar systems needed for effective night interception, lost the largest targets in the sky. The corridor belonged to the fighters now, to the Sabres and the MiGs, and what was at stake between them was no longer the fate of the bombers. It was the simple question of which side's pilots would stay alive long enough to break the other. The American who most clearly understood that question and who answered it in a way that cost him everything was a captain in the 334th Fighter Interceptor Squadron named George Andrew Davis, Jr. He had come to Korea already with victories behind him, 7 aerial kills from the Pacific in the Second World War, and he had added to that score steadily since his arrival. By the beginning of February 1952, he had 14 confirmed kills in Korea, which made him the leading American ace of the war to that point. He was 31 years old, a small, careful, precise pilot who preferred to get close before he fired and who had the patience to set up a shot rather than waste ammunition. On the 10th of February 1952, Davis was leading a flight of Sabres in the Yalu corridor when his flight spotted a large formation of enemy aircraft, reported as 12 MiG-15s and an estimated number of ground attack aircraft, moving toward a group of American fighter bombers working below. What Davis did next was not the calculated move of a man thinking about his own survival. He did not call for the rest of his formation to set up a coordinated attack. He rolled in alone, diving into the formation from above, and the fight that followed was as brief as it was one-sided. He shot down 2 of the attacking aircraft in the pass. His Sabre took hits. He did not pull away. His wingman, First Lieutenant William Littlefield, watched him continue the attack until his aircraft went out of control and went down into the mountains below. Davis was never found. The Medal of Honor was awarded posthumously. The citation described a pilot who gave his life to protect the aircraft below him, and that is accurate as far as it goes. But the men who had flown with him saw something else alongside the sacrifice. Davis was the kind of pilot who had been produced by a training system and a combat environment that valued aggressiveness in the clinch, the willingness to press inside comfortable range, to accept return fire in exchange for a certain kill. That was the thing the gun camera record of the best American aces in Korea showed, almost without exception. They got close. They accepted risk to reduce the margin of error. They fired when the target was large in the sight, not when it was a small shape at long range. Davis had done that 14 times and survived. On the 15th engagement, the same instinct that had made him lethal carried him past the edge. On the other side of the Yalu, inside the units of the 64th Corps, there were pilots who flew with the same kind of controlled aggression, and some of them were doing to the Americans what the best Americans were doing to them. The 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Yevgeny Popeliev, compiled a record during its time in Korea that stood among the most credible of the Soviet units. Popeliev was a veteran of the war against Germany, technically precise, disciplined, and possessed of the ability to read a developing engagement from a distance before he committed to it. His personal tally in Korea, while subject to the same accounting problems that afflicted every claim on both sides of the river, was regarded by post-war researchers as among the best documented of the Soviet pilots who fought there. He understood the MiG's advantages at altitude and used them methodically, and he understood its weaknesses in a close-turning fight and respected those limits. Popeliev's regiment and others like it were at their most dangerous in the same months, the late autumn and winter of 1951 into 52, when the gap between the Sabre's capability and the MiG's was still widest, and when Soviet veteran pilots were still leading the formations. The kills came on both sides in numbers that neither would fully acknowledge. The Americans reported their losses honestly because they had to, because aircraft and pilots were tracked through a bureaucracy that did not allow for creative accounting. The Soviets reported theirs through a system that rewarded commanders for success and punished them for failure, and the numbers that came out of that system have been argued over ever since by historians on both sides of what was once the Iron Curtain. What changed in the second half of 1952 was subtler than any single engagement. The Soviet rotation system, the practice of pulling out experienced units and replacing them with untested ones, meant that by mid-1952 many of the formations in MiG Alley were no longer being led by the men who had come to Korea with kills on their records from the last war. The fresh regiments were competent. They were not that. The Chinese and North Korean pilots, flying an increasing proportion of the missions in the corridor, were more eager than experienced, and eagerness against a disciplined F-86 with a computing gun sight was expensive. The Sabre pilots of the 4th and 51st Wings had by then been at this for more than a year. They had learned the MiG's tendencies. They had learned where it bled speed in a turn and where it picked it up in a dive. They had learned that a MiG pilot who decided to extend the fight into lower altitudes, where both aircraft were closer to equal, was a pilot who had given up his one certain advantage. The American pilot who extracted the most from those lessons during the peak period of 1952 and early 53 was a Texan named Joseph Christopher McConnell, Jr., who flew with the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing and who accumulated victories with a methodical thoroughness that unnerved even the men who flew alongside him. McConnell had not seen combat in the Second World War. He had spent those years as a navigator before transitioning to fighters, which meant he came to Korea without the instinctive aggressive habits that had gotten several of the earlier aces killed. He was careful the way a man is careful when he knows his limitations and has worked to remove them. He got close before he fired. He used the A4 gun sight the way it was designed to be used. By the middle of May 1953, he had 16 confirmed kills, the highest score of any American pilot in the Korean War. He was pulled from combat shortly after his 16th victory over the protests of his commanders because the Air Force had decided it could not afford to lose him the way it had lost Davis. By the spring of 1953, the character of the air war over MiG Alley had shifted in a way the men who flew it could feel before they could measure it. The MiGs still appeared in the corridor. There were still days when large formations came south across the Yalu, and the fights that followed were as violent as anything the war had produced. But those days were growing fewer. The formations that did appear were less willing to press their attacks deep into the engagement, where the Sabre's gun sight and the Sabre pilot's experience were most dangerous. A MiG that entered a fight against a veteran American pilot at medium altitude in early 53 was, much of the time, in serious trouble, and the men on the north bank of the Yalu knew it. The losses being absorbed by the Chinese and North Korean units were unsustainable. Whether the Soviet units were also taking unsustainable losses is a harder question, because the Soviet records that have become available since the end of the Cold War tell a story considerably more damaging than anything acknowledged at the time, and historians examining those records disagree about how to read them. What is certain is that by the summer of 1953, the tactical equation in MiG Alley had been reversed from what it had been in the autumn of 1950. The men who had come to Korea with the better machine were flying it with increasing caution against an enemy who had learned exactly how to exploit every moment of caution. The armistice came on the 27th of July, 1953, and the guns went quiet over the Yalu the same way they went quiet everywhere else in Korea. Not with any resolution, not with any clear winner or loser on the ground, but with an exhaustion that had become indistinguishable from the war itself. The ceasefire line was very close to where it had been before the war began. The cost of arriving back at roughly the starting point had been appalling on every side. For the American Air Forces, the official accounting of the air war produced a number that entered the history books almost immediately and was treated for decades as settled fact. The kill ratio, the number of MiGs destroyed for every Sabre lost in air-to-air combat, was claimed at approximately 10-1 in favor of the Sabre. Nearly 800 MiGs destroyed, fewer than 80 Sabres lost to enemy aircraft in the same period. That number was repeated in official documents, in newspaper accounts, in the memoirs of the pilots who flew the Sabres, and in the institutional literature of the Air Force for a generation. The problem with the number is that it has not survived contact with the records. When the Soviet archives became partially available to researchers in the years after the Cold War ended, and when careful historians began the process of cross-referencing American claims against Soviet acknowledgments and against the gun camera footage both sides retained, what emerged was a picture considerably less clean than 10-1. The Soviet records showed losses that were considerably higher than the Soviets had admitted publicly during or after the war, which meant their pilots were dying in numbers they had never acknowledged and dying more often to Sabre guns than the official Soviet history had allowed. But the American claims were also inflated, as claims in air combat almost always are, because pilots in a fight see what they can see and report what they believe, and two pilots often claim the same aircraft, and aircraft that are damaged and trailing smoke often fly away and land rather than falling. The actual ratio, when the best available evidence from both sides is examined, appears to have been somewhere in a range that most researchers put between roughly 2-1 and perhaps 4-1 in favor of the Sabre, depending on which records are weighed and how the counting is done. That number is less dramatic than 10-1. It also tells a more truthful story, because a war in which the margin was 2 or 3-1 was not a war the MiG pilots lost because their machine was inferior. It was a war they lost because of the rotation system that erased institutional knowledge, because of the political boundary that constrained their tactics while leaving the Sabre pilots' tactics unconstrained, because of the training gap that widened as the war continued and fresh American pilots arrived with better preparation than the enemy they faced, and because of an intelligence and communication structure that gave the Americans information about MiG movements the Soviets could not match. The men who flew the MiGs in those corridors were, many of them, as skilled and as brave as any pilots who fought in the Korean War. The ones who came to Korea with experience from the war in Europe and flew the first year over the Yalu proved exactly how dangerous a veteran in a high-performance jet could be. The men in the Sabres who survived long enough to become that kind of dangerous themselves learned quickly that the enemy across the river was not a problem to be dismissed. What the Sabre pilots had, in the end, was not genius or invincibility. It was continuity. The knowledge of how to fight the MiG was alive in their squadrons at every point in the war, passed from the men who had learned it first to the men who arrived later, refined by every engagement and sharpened by every gun camera frame examined in the debrief room at Kimpo and Suwon. The computing gun sight made the physics of deflection something any pilot could solve. The improved Sabre made the envelope of the fight wider. But the thing that mattered most in the cumulative arithmetic of a 2-year duel was the way a single Air Force accumulated and transmitted what it was learning every day. The pilot at 40,000 feet over the Yalu on that spring morning in 1951 was not wrong about his aircraft. He was not wrong about the altitude advantage, or about the cannon, or about the river that protected his base. He was wrong about the men below him, about whether they were the same men they had been in December of 1950, about whether the disadvantages they had started with were permanent or temporary. They were temporary. The disadvantages were being closed by a process he could not see and could not participate in, carried out in debrief rooms and training syllabi in engineering modifications, and a rotation system that kept knowledge alive in the formation even as individual pilots left and new ones arrived. The MiGs did not disappear from the sky because they were beaten in a single decisive engagement. They were beaten in the way air wars are always really decided, in 100 ordinary fights over a long time, each one teaching the surviving side something the other side was also paying to learn, until the weight of the learning could no longer be equaled. By the time the armistice came, the men who had mocked what they found below them over the Yalu had been gone from that corridor for months, replaced by pilots whose predecessors had not survived long enough to teach them what to fear. The Sabres were still there, still flying the alley, still ready, and the sky above them was, for the most part, empty. The Soviet pilots who survived Korea went home to an air force that could not publicly acknowledge they had been there. The victories they had earned, the lessons they had learned, the men they had lost, all of it went into files that would stay classified for decades. They could not speak about it. They attended no reunions with the men on the other side, read no accounts in Western newspapers that named them, received no public recognition for what they had done. For a generation, the Korean Air War was a story told entirely from one direction, and the men on the other side of the Yalu existed only as the targets the gun cameras caught. What the full record shows, when both sides are placed together in the same frame, is not a story of one kind of aircraft humiliating another. It is a story of two systems at war. And the system that survived that war in better condition was the one that treated knowledge as a resource to be conserved and accumulated rather than one that was abandoned with the units that had acquired it. The MiG was a better aircraft in the places where it was measured alone. The force that flew it was, for a time, a better fighting force than the one it faced. What it could not do was remain that force through 2 years of attrition against an enemy who never stopped learning. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.